Hey guys, my name is Andrew, and this video series is going to all be about subnetting in networks, right? And we're mostly going to be looking at breaking down Internet Protocol version 4. All right, so IPv4 and IPv6 networks. Now, predominantly this series 6 is really all about IPv4, but at the end we'll touch on and we'll cover up and we'll wrap up with IPv6. But we're going to be working on breaking down and manipulating IPv4 address into either bigger or smaller subnetworks given a set or series of addresses in order to manipulate them to fit our needs. Now, in order to get to this point, first we're going to cover some of the basics of what is subnetting and what it's really all about, and to give ourselves some context. And then we're going to be looking at breaking down some number and some set of decimal values, which is generally going to be our IPv4 address. So if we had an example here, say 192.168.42.0, all right? So we're going to take this decimal number and we're going to break it down into its binary values so we can manipulate these values later. All right, so say this 192, and I'm just going to write it out for you as 2 ones and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 zeros. And we're going to go through and manipulate these values. And we're also going to take a brief look at hexadecimal values, which is in our IPv4 world here. So our 0 through 9, as we have here in our decimal form, but also that A through F, all right? And we're also going to look at the binary equivalent and kind of like the decimal equivalent of that A through F as well. We'll also provide an additional context, so maybe not just IP addresses, but you may also see this in working with MAC addresses, and how do MAC addresses and IP addresses work with one another, and how are they the same, and how might they be different in our given networks. We'll also be looking at, as we take these numbers down to this decimal format, bringing them back up to this IP, this decimal format from the binary to the decimal. All right. Once we get past the basics of the binary and working with taking our decimal values, bringing them down to this binary format, bringing them back up to decimal, back and forth, we'll be able to start looking at the actual structure of our IPv4 address, all right? And what makes up the different sections, these different octets, and how do we, and after we take a look at this, and how do we actually determine what is the network portion of our address? How do we determine what represents the network we're operating on, say some of these different octets here, and maybe which section represents the hosts, the different devices that are dynamic on our network, all right? We're going to be looking at that and how it relates to a subnet mask, right? You may have seen this before, this 255.255.255.0, and this value can be manipulated and changed as we see fit in order to increase or decrease the size of any one of our given networks. So after we get a little more familiar with this, we are then going to take it a step further and say, okay, so now we know what an IP address is and we have this subnet mask. How can we determine the whole size of our network, right? And we're going to be able to actually break down the network portion of our address. So what is our network? The first address that we can use, the last address we can use, and then by virtue all the stuff in the middle, and then our broadcast address. And throughout the course, there will be a short video on what is broadcast, unicast, multicast, and how that all plays into this system. After this, we'll have the basics here, we'll understand where a network begins, where it ends, and we'll be able to move on to VLSM, or variable length subnet masks. From here, we can start looking at taking this number and manipulating our subnet mask here, and maybe instead of this being 255, I don't know, this might be 248, all right? And what does making this, what is changing this value do to the overall structure of this address right in here, right? How does that change the address? How does that change where the network begins and where it ends? Okay, and we'll be looking at that structure, how to manipulate it, and how it all comes together. And finally, after coming through all of that and how we manipulate these IPv4 addresses, we're going to take a look at IPv6, all right? And the broad structure where we move on from just this decimal here to maybe, you know, some type of hexadecimal, so, you know, DB8, and so on and so forth, right? And we're going to have this big, long IPv6 address. And when we get there, it might look a little intimidating, but after going through all of this IPv4, you'll actually find that IPv6 is quite a bit easier to use and to work with, all right? Now, I mentioned terms in here like broadcast and unicast, and we'll also look at the different classes, A, B, C, D, E, you know, the different classes of IP addresses. We'll also look at the difference between public addresses and private addresses, being able to identify them, RFC 1918 and how that, you know, what that has to do with our different private addresses and how this all comes together. So those videos will be riddled throughout. And finally, as I said before, finally, but I really mean it this time, finally, I will also include additional videos with some, you know, some testing throughout. All right, so we'll actually have some challenge videos, if you will, or at least just some testing challenges where I'll give you a few examples and then I'll provide the solution afterwards to work through those different examples. See you guys in the next one.